So, I guess you could call this the unofficial part 2 to the video I just posted, as of this recording, I mean, where I talked about what Disney villains, the Disney Villain Land needs to do to get people interested. And in that video, I talked about how it's been very blatant that Disney, and again, Universal's guilty of this too, every company copies off another. I'm not an idiot, and that's just called competition. But it's very obvious that Disney looked over at Universal Studios' homework and went, we can do that too. And what I mean by that is, the Universal Studios launched the Universal Monsters line, which they've still been keeping strong, which I really appreciate as a fan of those movies. But then, not too much longer after that, there was a whole thing of the Disney Villain line coming out, like the Disney Villain line. Hell, even the font they use for the Disney Villain line in some cases is almost exactly like the Universal Monsters font. Like, that cannot be coincidence. And that was probably the reason why they put out the Disney Villain Land, was because of Dark Universe over at Epic Universe. We can all agree that was probably the case. So this video is going to be talking about why I know the Universal Monsters are better than the Disney villains. Now, if you think differently, that's totally fine. I got no problem with you. But I'm about to say some. I'm probably going to say some pretty heretical things to some people. There's going to be some hurt feelings here and there. But know that I say this stuff, and I say this stuff with love for Disney villains. But when it comes to the Universal Monsters, yeah, they're the favorite child. It's not even close. Anyway, so let's get started. So, basically, let's get things out of the way. Why are the Universal Monsters better than Disney villains? I think the answer is pretty simple right out the gate. They're just more complex. And I know what you're going to say. Oh, they're just dumb monsters from a bygone era of, black and white films. What era do you think the start of the Disney company started? Do you think they just showed up at... I've seen people like this where they don't even acknowledge, and I know not everyone is like this, but I've seen so many people say oh, Disney just hit the ground running out of nowhere. I'm like, where do you think they originally came from in the 30s? Anyway, so the Disney Corporation wasn't a thing yet. It was back in the 30s. Walt was still gaining traction in a lot of places. I might have my timelines mixed up, but by then there was the wheels were starting to turn for Walt, even if they're there slowly. But let's actually talk about it. Let's dissect that whole thought process to begin with. The whole thing of, the Universal Monsters are dumb because they come from an era of black and white films. And to which I say, you mean the golden era of films. The Universal Monsters were kind of responsible for building the ground up for Universal Studios. Without them, you wouldn't have Shrek. Yeah, think on that. If it were not for the Universal Monsters, we'd never have Shrek, or How to Train Your Dragon, or even a Universal Studios. So that's one thing they have. And yes, Mickey Mouse did start his company, but the funny thing is, you've sometimes seen this. Even Miramax is known as the house Freddy built, but you hardly ever see a company build itself from such small bits and pieces like Universal Studios did with the horror films. And it also is a winning combination of, when you do horror films, they're cheap to make. 9 times out of 10, they're very cheap to make, and you more than likely get your money back 10 times over every time. That's another thing, is that these movies were fast to make, and also, they made their money back real fast. Now, let's talk about characters in general for the Universal Monsters. The Disney villains are all great. But you know what they aren't? Complex. And I like Disney villains. Don't get me wrong. I love villains who don't have any complexity, and sometimes they just need to be evil. I don't need every villain to like commit an evil deed and just then sit down the hero and be like, okay, now you have to understand why I did that, and it was a place of love. It would really suck if Palpatine did that, like after committing Order 66, sat Anakin down and said, alright, so I'm really the good guy, and the Jedi needed to go because they were starting to turn evil. I had the best intentions. No, we don't like Palpatine like for that. We like him because he's a bastard of a being, and that's why we like the Disney villains, because sometimes they're just not that. A lot of them are not that complex. They tried to over-complex a lot of their villains with the surprise villain, but guess what? Surprise villains aren't complex. That's just surprise. We have a bad guy all of a sudden. That's really it. Is that there's no real characterization to them. It's just, oh, they're suddenly, I'm the bad guy now. Whereas the Universal monsters, outside of really Dracula, and Dracula does have some defending nature to him, they're not really the bad guys. The monsters aren't really the bad guys. They're almost like, they are shadows of us. The monsters are basically shadows of us. Perfect example. And the best example, the Frankenstein monster. There's a reason why while Dracula was the first, the Frankenstein monster is kind of the face of the Universal monsters. He is a guy who never asked to be born. He was thrown into a situation by a father who just wanted to make him to say that he could and defy the laws of, like, man and religion. He has no understanding of self or his strength, and he just wants to feel accepted into society and loved by others. How many of you out there have felt that? Like, how many of you out there have felt, like, that you wanted to belong? And also, the other caveat of that is that James Whale, the director of both Frankenstein and Bride of, was gay. He was one of the first openly gay directors of the time, in the 1930s. That's a terrifying situation to be, to come out at that time. Yeah. So he put a lot. You see him put a lot of that that feeling of being ostracized and feeling outcasted, especially in the Bride of Frankenstein. There is some very good subtle, Christianity, sacrilegious imagery that somehow he got away with in that movie. Anyway, but yeah, the Wolfman. Let's talk about the Wolfman. The Wolfman is a guy who had a disease that he could not cure and is being ostracized and hunted for it, and it's driving him insane. That can be the werewolf. The werewolf disease, the lycanthropy, has been used in multiple films since then to represent a disease and, that beast within we cannot contain, or that disease that is eating us alive. That looks like to be the case in the 2025 remake coming soon. So, and yeah, how many times have we seen someone in our lives, or even ourselves, that have had diseases that are stuck with us and we just can't cure? The Mummy is a man who wanted to feel loved. The creature from the Black Lagoon was a being who was tormented by men trying to colonize his home and steal him from his land, and also wanted to feel loved. He was it was like a King Kong kind of film where he was killing those people because they were attacking him and invading his home. He was just an animal wanting to be left alone. Dracula himself, in some level, yeah, he's probably what you would call the most evil. But look at it as he is the immigrant. He is the outsider. He is the one who is not. He is, and some people have kind of made this, I don't know, like saying that the outside immigrant, and I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. I've seen much better videos here on YouTube explain it better, where they say that the immigrant that is not that is out from the outside world looking in, and that feeling of wanting to come to a better world. Again, much better videos explain it better than I do. That's just an example. But yeah, here's a guy, he's out of time, he's kind of like he's alone. I mean, yeah, but keep in mind, Dracula, out of all of them, is probably the most evil of them all, but you can still see, like, the building, like, the pieces are there. The Invisible Man. A man just wanting to feel like Jack Griffin said multiple times in that movie, I was a poor son of a bitch who had a great idea that no one wanted to listen to. How many times have we had that? It's more, there is, while the monsters are meant to be scary, and those films are considered film noir and some of the greatest films of all time, you do see that the monsters are not they are victims as they are the villains. They are both victim and villain, and in some cases you can make the argument that the monster is the hero or the protagonist of the story, and the people that are attacking them are how we see, we put so much of ourselves into those monsters. Villains, we're just like, I'm so Maleficent, I have such a bad day that I'm yelling at everybody. Or, I don't know, if I'm like the evil queen, where I'm like, if I don't feel good about myself, I just yell at a mirror. I'm taking this from some TikTok videos, and you might have seen them. Whereas with the Universal Monsters, and not to say that I've seen people like that with the Universal Monsters, but on the vast majority, there's a more almost spiritual connection we as the audience have with the monsters, because at one time or another, we have felt the way they have felt. Scared, alone, angry, forlorn, all of that. We have felt that with one monster, regardless, at one point in our lives, or do we now? We have that now in our lives. We will look at the monster and go, we will 9 times out of 10 look at the monsters of that era and be like, yeah, I see where he's coming from. I mean, it's wrong, he's killing people, but yeah, I see where he's coming from. Yeah. So, the Disney villains are just fun. And there's nothing wrong with that. Classic Disney villains are just fun. But if we're going to compare apples to oranges, the Universal monsters are just better. They're just hands down better. If you want movies and characters that have stood the test of time, and will probably stand the test of time long after we're all gone, there you go. If you want to have fun, here you go. The other thing I think the Universal monsters have is that a good majority of them, in fact all of them if you play your cards right, you can actually write yourselves. A lot of them are public domain, and Gilman, you can just make a swamp monster in return to get around that, or just use a different mummy. You can write your own stories with Dracula, the Wolfman. You can't use Jack Talbot, but you see where I'm going with this. All of those characters. So, can't do that. You can't make a book with Disney characters unless you're licensed by Disney. That's just me, the writer in me, kind of having a one-up right there. Anyway, so I thought this would be a cool, continuation of what I was talking about from the previous one, because I was like, yeah, it's very clear that Disney has been just copying Universal Studios' homework when it came to the Universal monsters and the Disney villains. And I've seen a lot of people trying to say, oh, the Disney villains are clearly better than the monsters. And to that I say, ha 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 ha, you're wrong. Yeah, so, but if you guys like the Disney villains more than the Universal monsters, that's totally fine. I got no problem with you. This is just how I feel. So you guys tell me in the comments below, do you think the Universal monsters are just better than the Disney villains? Just comment. I know it's a weird conversation, but let's see where this goes. Just comment below, let me know. Other than that, I hope you all enjoyed this. I'm Mr. Multiverse. I'll see you next time in the Multiverse.